Now a few words about the Ewing Halsell Distinguished Lecture series. Ewing Halsell was a prominent cattle rancher with operations spanning Texas and Oklahoma. He and his wife, Lucille, adopted San Antonio as a second home. They considered their good fortune a blessing, not a right. They believed an integral part of that blessing was sharing it. So they created the Ewing Halsell Foundation to improve the quality of life for all Texans. The foundation established the Ewing Halsell Distinguished Lecture series to bring internationally prominent speakers in the arts and sciences to San Antonio. We're honored that Raul B. Rodriguez has agreed to serve as our moderator this evening. Raul is the Associate Vice President for International Affairs at Monterrey Tech in Mexico. Previously, he has served as CEO of the North American Development Bank and chairman of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation in New York. In San Antonio, he has been chairman of the World Affairs Council and the Free Trade Alliance. He was founding co-chair of the city's International Advisory Council. And he's the Tom Benson Chair in Banking and Finance and Distinguished Professor at the University of Incarnate Word. Raul, thank you so much for being here. And now I will turn the podium over to a man who needs no introduction for many of us. Dr. Francisco Cigarroa is director of the University Transplant Center and chair of the Ford Foundation Board. Formerly, he served as UT Health San Antonio president and chancellor of the University of Texas. And with that, I would like to pass the microphone to Dr. Cigarroa.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bergman. It is such a privilege for me to be able to introduce this evening Dr. Rachel Pearson and Mr. Darren Walker. Rachel Pearson is a distinguished faculty member in the Department of Pediatrics in the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics. She's an award-winning author who has a unique ability to clearly address issues related to social justice, ethics, and medicine. Her 2018 book, entitled No Apparent Distress, A Doctor's Coming of Age on the Front Lines of American Medicine, was named an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review. Her stories poignantly reveal the impact of inequality on the body and in spirit, and center the humanity of children and families who are experiencing medical crises caused by violence, marginalization, and other forms of systemic injustice. This year, we're so proud that she became a fellow of the founding cohort of Ford Foundation's Global Fellowship Program, which no doubt will be an incredible journey for her, and it will highlight our university globally. So Rachel, thank you for being a part of this forum.
It's an honor. Thank you.
You bet. And now let me introduce Darren Walker. So Darren is president of the Ford Foundation, guided by a vision of social justice, a world in which all individuals, communities, and peoples work toward the protection and the full expression of their human rights, are active participants in the decisions that affect them, share equitably in the knowledge, in the wealth, and the resources of society, and are free to achieve their full potential. Ford's mission has been to reduce poverty and injustice, strengthen democratic values, promote international cooperation, and advance human achievement. Darren is leading innovative change across philanthropic foundations, highlighted by his book entitled From Generosity to Justice, A New Gospel of Wealth. Under his leadership, the Ford Foundation, 3 months ago, became the first non-for-profit foundation in U.S. history to issue a $1 billion social justice bond to increase grant making, to stabilize and to strengthen not-for-profit organizations in the wake of COVID-19 during these unprecedented times. Darren well knows that it is our grantees that are on the front lines of social justice reform. Darren also has chaired the Philanthropic committee that brought a resolution to the city of Detroit's historic bankruptcy. Importantly also, he's a co-founder of the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy. Before joining Ford Foundation, Darren was vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, overseeing global and domestic programs. He serves on many distinguished boards, including the National Gallery of Arts. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and recipient of 16 honorary degrees, including Harvard's Dubois Medal. Darren is among one of the most influential citizens of our nation, and he truly exemplifies the American dream. He was born at Charity Hospital in Lafayette, Louisiana, and raised by his beautiful mother in Ames and later in Baytown, Texas. He was one of the first children to benefit from the Head Start program, and then graduated from UT Austin and subsequently from UT Austin's School of Law. No doubt he exemplifies UT Austin's motto, what starts here changes the world. Darren has made our world a better and a healthier planet through his leadership and his great team at Ford. On a personal note, his greatest attribute is that he is one of the most intelligent, visionary, compassionate, and empathetic individuals that I have the privilege to know and the privilege to work with. It is an honor to have Darren as our keynote speaker for the Ewing Halsell Lecture Series. Ruth, thank you very much for allowing me to introduce Rachel and Darren.
Thank you so much, Francisco. I consider having you as chair of the board of the Ford Foundation a great privilege. There is no leader like you I have encountered in my many years of working with extraordinary leaders. You exemplify the best of servant leadership. And you have kept me connected to my great home state of Texas. Although I speak to you from the east side of Manhattan, my heart remains in Texas because it is that state and of course the great university in Austin that made it possible for my journey that has led me here to New York tonight, and the great honor of being invited to speak at this amazing Ewing Halsell Lecture. I am just extraordinarily honored and grateful. So thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Raul. I appreciate the opportunity to open with some reflections on this moment when we are all gripped. We are gripped by, of course, as you all know, as health leaders and professionals, we are gripped by this pandemic, but we are also gripped by other pandemics. The pandemic of poverty and inequality, the pandemic of racism and injustice. But we at the Ford Foundation are in the business of hope. And so I come to you tonight with a message of hope. But that message begins with an idea of American philanthropy, which is a message of hope. And our notions of American philanthropy were formally organized in the late 19th century when Andrew Carnegie published his seminal essay, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889. And in that document, he laid out his vision for charity, for generosity, for giving back, for taking the tremendous wealth and bounty that had been bestowed upon him and that he had earned as the era's greatest industrialist. He laid out the precepts of this new gospel that he hoped would guide other wealthy men like himself. And of course, his great friend, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Frick, J.P. Morgan and so many other wealthy capitalists of the 20th century adopted the ideas in this new gospel. And in the new gospel, Carnegie did not reflect on or was not worried about inequality per se. What he believed was that the issue was not that there was inequality or injustice in the world, but that men like himself and Rockefeller were chosen by God to determine what to do with their bounty and how to distribute that bounty. And that was their work and their mission. It is why he believed he had to die not a wealthy man, and why he gave so much of his wealth away. But he was not concerned about inequality. I am inspired by an essay I read that Martin Luther King wrote about philanthropy in 1968. And in this essay, he wrote the following: "Philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary." Dr. King had a different idea about philanthropy. His idea was that philanthropy should be used to advance justice and dignity. So his notion moves us from charity and generosity to dignity and justice. That is a different calling for philanthropy. Of course, we must have charity and generosity, but in a democracy, justice is essential, the belief in justice. And we who are privileged, institutions and individuals who have benefited greatly from the opportunity that this country has uniquely provided to millions of people over 4 decades, over 4 centuries. I think the challenge that Dr. King put forth was a challenge that asks the privileged to hold the mirror up and ask, what have I done to contribute to the injustice? Has my wealth been accumulated in a way that benefits society or harms society? What am I culpable? Has my privilege so much insulated me that I am unable to understand the suffering of the common person? As a capitalist and living in a capitalist democracy, we are challenged today because we are seeing the intersection of capitalism and democracy play out. And we must ensure that democracy comes first. And so as we consider the moment we're in, a period of unprecedented inequality, those of us who are privileged, those of us who have benefited, we have benefited inordinately these last 3 decades. As someone who has lived with privilege and without privilege, it is a very different lived experience to live with privilege. And so the question for us, those of us with privilege today, is not how do I give back? The question for us is, what am I willing to give up? Because in order to have the more fair, just world that we all seek, we must be prepared to allow opportunity to truly abound, to spread across this great nation. And in order for that to happen, we're going to have to reconsider some of our institutions. We're going to have to reconsider some of the privileges that allows those of us with wealth to always be at the front of the line and expect and feel entitled that we should be at the front of the line because we have wealth. In a democracy, hope is important. It is essential. Hope is at the center of the American narrative. Indeed, hope is the oxygen of democracy. But inequality asphyxiates hope. It makes a people hopeless. It makes more people cynical about institutions, and it drives people apart and makes it harder to solve common problems because the average citizen believes that the institutions and systems of our democracy are rigged in favor of the privileged and the few. And so my challenge to you all and to my institution is to look within ourselves, to do our very best to spread the greatness of this country, the opportunity that has made it possible for a boy who started life on a dirt road in rural Liberty County in a shotgun shack to have gotten on that mobility escalator that only in America could my story be realized, my aspirations and my dreams be actualized. So I stand before you tonight with great honor, humility, and gratitude for the opportunity to speak to you and be with you. So thank you for this. And Raul, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Darren. It's a privilege, a good kind of privilege, to welcome you to your home state and to your extended alma mater. Let me touch on the focus of your book, which you've just described perfectly, and ask you about the transition at Ford and philanthropy in general. And one of the elements of that transition, and Francisco touched on that briefly, is what you're doing this year, which, as you've mentioned, is a year of particular challenges, which we haven't seen in ages. You just issued the first ever social bond in order to bolster your giving together with other foundations. Can you tell us more about that? Among other things, I'm sure the audience will be interested in why did you decide to borrow rather than take from your $13 billion endowment? And how do you think this provides a model that can be used in other realms, for example, in higher education?
Let me start by saying it was a radical move, but all things are possible in a mission organization when you have a board like the trustees of the Ford Foundation. Because I have served on some 38 nonprofit boards, public company boards, and I know the difference that a board can make in what is possible for a mission organization. And in this case, as an endowed philanthropy, as we considered at the very start of the COVID crisis, when our endowment was no longer 13 billion. Raul, we, much to Francisco's horror, we were about $10 billion at some point. And as we were experiencing that reduction in the value of our endowment, we were starting to hear from the nonprofits that the foundation supports. And we support over 1,500 nonprofits around the world with grant making. We were hearing from them how their fundraisers were being canceled, how donors were backing out of their pledges for this year, that if they were an arts organization, their theaters were dark and they no longer had revenue. And so it became very clear to us at Ford that we were going to have to take action above and beyond the $550 million that our trustees had approved for grants this year. And as I talked with Francisco and our investment professionals, the advice was very consistent. Now is not the time to actually liquidate the portfolio and sell. In fact, we need liquidity in a volatile time. And so I have a background as in banking and have some knowledge of the markets, and spent almost a decade on Wall Street, and watching what was happening with Fed policy. It became clear that money was going to be pretty cheap. And in talking again with Francisco and our investment committee and our really terrific CIO, I suggested this as a means to actually raise capital to immediately give away this year. Again, while it was an unprecedented idea, there have been any number of unprecedented things that we have done at Ford in recent years. And again, if you look at any institution that is written about or you experience, and there are great things happening, innovative things happening, or if the organization is calcified and not really evolving well, you can leave at the doorstep of the board that the reasoning and the rationale for that. And I, again, am just incredibly lucky that the board of Ford has always been open to new ideas, innovation, and ingenuity. And my job is to be able to deliver on that consistently.
And as you've said, you're spearheading the possibility of other institutions and other sectors of doing something akin. Right?
Well, of course, you can imagine, Raul, what I believe what is potentially possible here. We have huge inequality in our systems. Imagine if a group of wealthy private universities decided they wanted to help some of the HBCUs. It's quite possible. Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton, et cetera, are all AAA credits. They could borrow money on behalf of those institutions and work in very creative ways to, I believe, to generate significant capital for those undercapitalized organizations and address the historic inequality that has existed. I mean, if you look at the aggregate of over 100 historically Black colleges and universities, their collective endowment is less than literally 5% of Harvard's endowment. So there's a lot of opportunity that I could imagine that could come from this model.
You mentioned in your opening remarks that you're a testament to upward mobility, the upward mobility escalator, as you called it. And it actually has defined the American dream. But you also said that it has essentially stopped. If you read different reports, Raj Shetty and others, you can say it's actually moving backward, and the pandemic will make it worse. How do we think we can rebuild the on-ramp to an effective mobility escalator?
That's a great question, Raul. And in fact, as you say, I'm very proud that the Ford Foundation has been a longtime supporter of Raj Shetty's research when he was at Harvard and then at Stanford and now back at Harvard. But the reality and the fact today, regrettably, is that the mobility escalator has stopped and is indeed, as you say, Raul, going in reverse for some. My shorthand is, if you want the American dream, move to Canada, because the Canadians are delivering on mobility. And what we want to be clear is we're talking about people who are in the top quartile, moving to the top 10, or if you're in the second quartile, moving to the top quartile, etc. That kind of mobility that we historically saw in America. I'm an extreme case. I was born in the bottom 1% and now I'm in the top 1%. But even the more normative mobility, we are not delivering on that. And we need to address it by looking at the systems and structures that are producing so much inequality, the policies that produce inequality. And that starts with our educational system. It starts with our tax system, the economic policies that in so many ways advance the interests of the wealthy and those with assets. Because if you have assets, it unlocks all sorts of creative ways to use our tax system to your advantage. And most Americans don't have and have not accumulated that kind of asset and base, and therefore they don't have the opportunity to reduce their total tax commitment because they are just regular folks who may, if they're lucky, have a mortgage. And that gives them some benefit. But we have to look at all of the systems and structures. And then we have to also, particularly for people who historically have been left out and left behind, address the underlying reasons for that. Racism, which is an underlying reason we have a criminal justice system that locks up mostly Black and brown men and poor white men. That system was designed to actually deliver that outcome. And so we have to look systemically and say, how do we de-racialize this system? And in many instances, that is going to require us to reimagine the system, to dismantle and redesign the system, not to not have a justice system. Of course we must have a justice system. Of course we must have a policing system. But we need them to be fair and to have everyone be treated equally before the law.
But in addition to understanding the underlying issues and reasons for inequality and for social mobility to have stopped, we have a problem of perception. Pew published the results this week of their latest poll on key aspects of our political life. The widest spread among 10 indicators was on this statement, and I'll read it. Everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed today. 76% of Republicans say this describes the US well today, compared with 28% of Democrats. And over the past 2 years, this gap has increased by 11%. We're perceiving two completely different Americas. We have two sets of entrenched perspectives, interests, mindsets. How do you practice your gospel in these increasingly polarized times?
I believe that first, the Pew data are very discouraging and worrisome, not only on the dimensions you mentioned, Raul, but of course, trust in institutions, a belief in democracy as delivering on its potential for shared prosperity and other important dimensions. I believe that if we in this country are to truly realize the democracy we want, we're going to need, as leaders, to understand that we have lost our ability to lead with nuance, and that we have regrettably allowed nuance to be pushed out of public discourse, that the most of the challenges that face our country are complex. Complexity is filled with nuance. The gray space is where problems get solved, but we are increasingly incented and led by our leaders to go to the opposite ends rather than coming together. And I believe that we as leaders, and what I try to do is to think about how we bring people together to solve problems, recognizing that we have our individual identities. Of course, I'm a Black gay man in New York, but I have a lot of things in common with other categories of Americans. And one of the things we have to do and remember is that while we may all have unique attributes or be part of a particular racial group, etc., at the end of the day, we must share a common American identity. And that identity is in part what binds us together. And that identity is a belief in a set of things. We must share that belief in democracy, in democratic institutions, in facts, in science. And we need to have leaders, whether it's leaders of great health science centers like UTSA, or foundations, or political leaders who first think about how to unite us, how to heal the division that you speak of, Raul, and that the data confirms. We as a nation need leadership that will bring us together and help heal the division. In our communities, we need leaders who will heal the divisions locally. It is not an easy job. It's actually much easier to take us to opposite corners. It's much easier to speak in terms of Black and white. I mean, it's one of the things I saw recently, Raul, that was so moving on Facebook, the like and dislike symbols. The engineer who invented that was talking about how much he regretted inventing that, because he had no idea of the harm it would cause, because it left no room for anything in between. It was either like or dislike. And that in some ways, he invented a metaphor that has contributed to the discourse that leaves no space for the gray area and the kind of consensus building, the kind of work that it takes for democracy to work. No space for that. And so I hope that leaders, and I challenge myself to not be so hardened in my thinking that I am no longer able to learn or absorb a perspective that is not my own or I may disagree with. That's the challenge for leaders today.
On a positive note, the giving and philanthropic traditions in the US have absolutely no parallel in the world by any measure. If you take, for example, a 10-year span, close to 90% of the households in the US donate. And if you add time and talent to treasure, this is an amazingly engaged society, despite the change that we've seen over recent years. Do you see these traditions alive in the new generations? How are they evolving? I'm thinking, for example, the emergence of platforms like GoFundMe and other crowdfunding venues. Do you foresee Ford actually changing substantially over the next few years because of the new digital culture?
Well, I think we are already working in partnership with that new digital culture and with technologists, a new generation of technology philanthropists. And we are working in conjunction with philanthropists and social activists who use new tools like GoFundMe and other similar tools that are now available. The question is not whether people are active, because people are active. The question is, to what degree do we see the depth of activity, the depth of giving? And your data are correct, but in recent years, an increasing amount of giving has come from higher income people, and lower middle class Americans are actually, while they give a large percentage of their hard-earned dollars, they don't have the dollars to give away as much as they used to. And so giving is actually, as a percentage, down, in part because middle class wages have stagnated and middle class total disposable income has stagnated, while the income of upper income people have increased significantly, and therefore, not surprisingly, more wealth comes from this population. But it is important to remember that as a percentage of household income, middle class people in this country give away more money than higher income people as a percentage of their total wealth. And that says a lot about the middle class in America. And it also speaks to why we need a strong, robust, and vibrant middle class in this country.
I have about 12 more questions having to do, among other things, with books that I'm sure you've read, Michael Sandel's, which I understand you were reading out of the galleys. You were reading that before it was.
I had a great talk with Michael the other day. We do 4 talks once a month, and you know, you probably know Michael, but he's just amazing. And his book, The Tyranny of Merit, is a must read.
Coming out next week. Speaking of privilege, you got a copy ahead of time. So. And
one of the privileges of being president of the Ford Foundation.
Absolutely. And then Isabel Wilkerson, which just came out in August, which is amazing. And it presents a very interesting question, which is, should we focus on inequality alone? Is that enough? Difficult as it is, or should we go deeper into elements of caste? But anyway, we don't have time for that. And Ruth is going to open up Q&A for. Let me just ask one more question, and hopefully then as we come back, I'll ask a couple more. But you mentioned hope in your introduction, and 400 years ago this week, The passengers boarded the Mayflower in Plymouth, England. And after 10 crazy, grueling weeks at sea, they had the fortitude and the foresight to sign the Mayflower Compact, which was the first civil covenant of this land. And again, that is quite remarkable. I mean, from foundation, we've had the foresight, as I mentioned, to think of our civil life, of our civic engagement. Against the backdrop that you've described, you've defined yourself as a hopeless hopeaholic. You've said this is the only country of the world, and I'm quoting you from your introduction, where your story could even be possible. You've added that you see many reasons for hope. What concerns you the most about our future, and where do you see the silver lining?
Thank you for that, Raul. What concerns me most is that the ability for little boys and girls who are poor, who, like I was 56 years ago, when I sat on the porch of that little shotgun house in Ames, Texas, and a woman approached our yard and she told my mother that President Johnson was starting a new program for boys and girls like me and my sister, and it was called Head Start. And that in the summer of 1965, President Johnson was going to start the first class of Head Start, and would my mother enroll me? And it was through that program and other investments, public investments in me, that I really believed that my dreams, my aspirations for a better life could be realized. I always knew that my country was cheering me on. Even when I was confronted with racism and all other forms of discrimination, I still knew that my odds for success were high. I worry that today, little boys and girls in small towns, in rural America, in housing projects in Chicago and New York, do not feel that their dreams, their hopes and aspirations can be realized, and do not feel that their country is cheering them on. That is heartbreaking for me. And it's why every day I get up with joy at the chance to do the work that we do at the Ford Foundation. And so I see many reasons of hope out in the world, out in the streets during these last few months, in the courageous frontline people working for social justice that I encounter at the foundation. I see many reasons for hope today.
Thank you, Darren. Ruth will take care of kindly conducting the Q&A section, please.
Thank you, Raul.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. I feel like we just got started, and we do have questions coming in. We want to get to them, but the privilege of asking the first question goes to our very own Global Ford Foundation Fellow, Dr. Rachel Pearson. And those who joined us late should know that Rachel is a much celebrated recent hire for the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics, and she divides her time as a pediatric hospitalist at University Hospital and as a humanities scholar. Rachel, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Ruth. And Darren, I'm so moved by what you say. I'm also a person who lives an impossible American story, coming from a small town in Texas to get to live the life that I live. And the hope that every kid here can see their dreams realized is absolutely what drives me as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Here's my difficult question.
Okay, Rachel.
So you call on folks in positions of power to help dismantle the systems that further inequality. Arguably, medicine is one such system. Medical debt drives millions of Americans into poverty every year. Even so, some people within the profession argue that we doctors should stay in our lane. Just as the police may not be well equipped to respond to domestic violence or mental illness crises, physicians may be ill-equipped to tackle systemic injustice, health policy, and economic change. How do you respond to those who argue that we serve our patients best by focusing on the pathology and therapeutics that we spent decades learning and leave social justice to the experts?
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm so happy that you were selected in the inaugural class of the Ford Global Fellows. It's a remarkable group from all over the world. It was an extremely competitive process, and we're just so grateful that you are part of it. You have asked a very difficult question, Rachel. Let me start by saying I believe that people in the medical profession are and should be in the business of justice. That in no way impairs or takes you out of your lane. I believe that in a democracy, the right to health care is a fundamental right. And it is true that the pathology, the epidemiology, the unique training and credentials that you bring is the differentiator. But you also know more about people, about humanity than probably any other profession. And so I do believe there is a role for doctors and medical professionals to play in advocating for that right, because I don't believe doctors live with no conscience. And I don't believe that if the medical profession were to experience this country deciding that only rich people can have access to health care, that the medical profession would sit idly by and say, let's stay in our lane. Because I think the medical profession, by training and temperament, is interested in bettering humanity. And that is the most noble, valiant calling that one can devote your life to. And I can't imagine that being something that is limited to only staying in the lane of the training of your specialty or your discipline.
Well, that's a pretty good answer. Thank you.
We're going to move to some of our audience questions, if I may. And the first one is referring to your personal story, Darren. One of the reasons why only in America could someone follow their dreams out of the bottom 1% to the top is that there's no floor below which you can fall in America. Unlike in other wealthy countries that have a robust social welfare system that prevent folks from falling to the bottom. So do you believe we need to invest in infrastructure such as universal health care, free education, and other things like that, so that the floor can be raised. This would cut across race and class.
Thank you, Ruth. And I believe that's a great question, and it deserves an answer. I mean, I absolutely believe in the idea of universal access to healthcare. I believe that the opportunity to seek and achieve a credential of higher education ought to be a right for especially for working class and lower income people. And we should have a means tested system that ensures that those students who do well should be able to not be burdened by college debt. And I think when you survey the challenges for young people today, that the burden of college debt, which is something I couldn't imagine. I went to Austin, Texas in 1978 on basically a full scholarship between the Pell Grant and the nice Texas oil man who put up the scholarship for me, and all the way through law school. I could never have imagined leaving, even after 8 years in Austin with debt. And today, it's the number one reason why students, young graduates, feel that they are unable to move to the next level because they don't see a chance to begin to save to buy a house or buy an apartment because they've got a six-figure debt to pay off. And so I do believe that there is something to be said, and this especially goes for our flagship and our state and land grant universities who have had to adjust to the withdrawal of support from their legislatures and their public systems. The public financing that historically was there has been reduced. I believe this is harmful. And again, it is part of this an idea that we should pay less, we meaning people like me, should pay less and should be seeking ways to lessen our burden. And while it's true, no one really loves to pay taxes, we have to have sufficient revenue to create the public goods. I'm writing something that is going to appear in the New York Times this weekend because it's the 50th anniversary of the publication of Milton Friedman's famous essay on shareholder capitalism, in which he said that the idea of social responsibility for a corporation was a subversive idea, and that the corporation's only objective is to make money for shareholders. And if, to the extent that government can force taxes, can force diversity and employment, et cetera, that's government's role. But if the corporation and wealthy people are advocating consistently for less and less revenue as a percentage of total GDP in the public treasury, the public purse won't have the resources to finance the public goods. And the irony for me is that he wrote this in 1970 when we had spent billions to build the public goods that made it possible for the United States to be the envy of the world. And so I believe that there is work for us to do as a society to rebalance so that we are again investing in those public goods.
So referencing the comments about the division in our society, the Pew data and so forth, one of our listeners asks, would the discipline of mediation help, including in our government?
I think mediation is desperately needed. We've seen how mediation in the legal profession has been beneficial. I think we need leaders who have skills and believe that mediation is a good thing. One of the things we have too much of, I believe, are leaders who look at the idea of consensus as a repugnant idea. The idea of building bridges as an undesirable objective. And so, yes, mediation as a formal mechanism, I believe is needed in many facets. But I also believe leaders who believe in mediation and who are temperamentally suited for mediation is necessary. That's not to say that everything is about let's meet halfway. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I am saying that we in this country have so hardened our beliefs, and we are so seeking only to have those beliefs validated that we are unwilling to listen. Leaders are unwilling to listen, and leaders are incented to not listen because our bases, our political bases, reward us for not hearing the other side. And so we have to speak to why we have to hear the other side and why it's important that we not demonize, that we not gratuitously seek to discredit when ultimately that's harmful to the process.
And of course, getting people in leadership who are good at listening and who are skilled in mediation brings us back to the need to invest again in education. So we keep coming back to education. You talked earlier about investing in the historically Black colleges and universities. I don't think there's anybody probably in this audience who would quibble with the idea that education is a really good place to invest resources, whether philanthropic or public resources. But where else should we target strategic philanthropy if we want to see the biggest returns on investments in improving both social and economic equality? And where is the Ford Foundation investing to address these inequalities beyond education?
Well, first, I think we know from the research that investing in young people and very young people early on, as early as possible, is the highest return on investment for public dollars. That's incontrovertible. And to the extent that we can do more of that, we need to do more of that. The Ford Foundation is focused on the systems and policies and structures that erect barriers to opportunity, that ensure certain bad outcomes for some people and advantaged outcomes for others. And so those systems and policies are everything from our systems of mass incarceration to our systems of tax policy, to our systems of the arts and culture, which we haven't talked about, but which I believe are a fundamental reason why we have so much poverty of spirit in this country, in our systems of sustainability and the environment. And so we're investing in systems, in the public education, in what I call the 3 I's, the ideas, the institutions, and the individuals who are taking up the mantle that Dr. King set forth in saying that we need drum majors for justice. Those individuals like Rachel and her peers in the Global Fellows Program, and not only the Ford Foundation, in the Gates Foundation Fellows Program, in MacArthur, et cetera, that are supporting individuals. We have to invest in the people who are going to advance justice. And they are in the medical community, in the legal community, they are in the education community and other spheres. But we also have to invest in the institutions that are on the front lines, ensuring, for example, that our system of voting, because we believe, as Francisco enumerated, our mission that Henry left us to advance democracy and democratic practice. When every American votes, we will be advancing democracy. We will realize we want every American to vote, and therefore we support the organizations who are on the front lines, fighting in the courts, where they unfortunately are busier than ever, but also in just the public education about citizenship and civic responsibility. We have to invest in all of these I's, ideas, institutions, and individuals for our democracy to work.
There's a question that will be difficult to answer as written, but it could be a starting point. And the questioner says, I wonder what are the top 10 changes needed institutionally? You've alluded to a lot of them in your most recent comments. What are the top 10 changes needed institutionally and with public policy to begin dismantling racism and inequality today? So I wonder if we could just take this as a starting point for some areas that you haven't had a chance to address or want to reemphasize with more emphasis.
Sure. I mean, Ruth, I think it's really interesting when we have supported at the foundation research on the brain, in part because we came to understand that people have perspectives on other Americans and other people based on narratives, culture, and that those narratives inform how we experience and see and the stories we tell about each other. And that those narratives impact how we think about and how ultimately we feel about policies and the systems that undergird our democracy. And so I'll give you just very concretely, the Ford Foundation for over 2 decades was one of the first foundations to work on LGBT rights. No one called it that then in the 1980s, but it was an effort to broaden opportunity to include people who are LGBT. What we found was that by investing in narrative change and in cultural interventions, we contributed to a changing of perspectives about gay and lesbian people. That narrative and the data demonstrated clearly that as people experienced homosexuals as normal, they were less likely to stigmatize, to be in opposition to policies that gave us our normative rights. And so when we invested in media, in stories, in script writers, when Ellen, the most famous TV character of her generation, the girl next door, who everyone watched on Wednesday night for years, told her parents that she was gay, that was a cultural moment where many people, through the lens of culture, experienced a very profound change in their understanding of what it meant to be gay and lesbian. And there were many, many interventions like that that began to change the hearts and minds, because ultimately democracies are impacted by the hearts and minds of citizens. And so I think, and what we have learned is that, yes, research matters, and yes, we need data, but people need to see that we have much more in common than we sometimes think we do. And those cultural interventions make it possible for us to actually be a more united people.
And there's a comment on my screen that's been there in front of me since 7:38 from Tiffany, who says, "We are more alike than we are different." As if
She is so right. I couldn't agree more, Tiffany.
We are now at 8:12, and I'm going to pass the microphone back to Raul Rodriguez.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Rachel. In 1936, the same year the Ford Foundation was established, Langston Hughes published a beautiful poem, a gripping call to action. It was a condemnation of injustice and a call for change, as well as a tribute to hope in the American dream. Picking from two of its stanzas, "Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Equality is in the air we breathe." Thank you, Darren, for helping us clutch the hope we seek, for helping us recognize what we lack, but more importantly, as you just said, for realizing how much we have in common. And in addition to the op-ed that's coming up over the weekend, I hope there's a sequel to the New Gospel coming up too, or a memoir or something.
Well, you're very kind. I have a book that is, I'm reminded today, is due February 15th. And my editor at Random House reminded me today, much to my horror, because I'm nowhere near being finished with it. So I look forward to it, but thank you. This has been a huge honor to be a part of the Ewing Halsell lecture and this conversation. I've just enjoyed it so much.
And in closing, let me take the final 30 seconds before turning it over to Francisco to thank Dr. Cigarroa and Dr. Bergman for hosting us all for this exceptional contributions that they make to our community in so many fields. We trust they will convince Darren to continue this conversation in person,
yes,
in Texas as soon as trips and abrazos are possible again. Let me also acknowledge the leadership at Ewing Halsell and appreciate their support as always. Names like Fitzsimmons, Hart, Lewis, Scanlon, Austin, Moxagemba, and others embody civic spirit and a commitment to truly making a difference in our world. A big thank you to them, to our audience, and to Sheila, Alexandria, and the wonderful team at the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics. Francisco, thank you. Back to you.
Well, Darren, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for such a remarkable evening of conversation. I want to thank you for being an inspirational leader for all of us, but including our children and our younger generation, and also to leave us with that sunshine of hope, that through the work that you're doing and through the work of those in the front lines of advancing social justice, that we will get to a better place. And as always, one of my sayings is that we love you, and it's true.
Well, the feeling is deeply mutual. What a great honor. And I'm just really thankful for this just tremendous invitation. It's been really special. And yes, Raul, Francisco will hold me to that. And it doesn't take much to get me to want to come to San Antonio.
We'll remember that. We will remember that. With this, our evening comes to a close. Thank everyone for your participation. This has been recorded and we will be posting it on the center's website and on www.panpals.org, which is curated by Rachel Pearson. Thank you, everyone, and good night.